I think the biggest thing from him is that you have to have a certain base level of knowledge to understand what kind of training should be done given the circumstances, and then where it should go from there. But that takes experience. And I think a lot of coaches nowadays go like, oh, I'm doing this philosophy, or I'm doing this training program, and we're going to do this. And they'll just do it without any sort of adaptive responses or any changes or modifications along the way, because they're so tied to it.
Welcome to the Upside Strength Podcast, your number one fitness and performance resource in Switzerland. Today on the podcast, I'm happy to welcome renowned sprint coach Derek Hansen. Derek is an international sport performance consultant that has been working with athletes of all ages and abilities in speed, strength, and power sports since 1988. He serves as a performance consultant to numerous professional teams in the NFL, NBA, MLS, and NHL, as well as major NCAA Division I programs through North America, specializing in speed development, strategic performance planning, return to competition protocols, and neuromuscular electrical stimulation programming. Derek, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sean.
It's a pleasure. So for the few listeners that might not know who you are, can you tell us about your background and how you first got into the sprinting world?
I was a track and field athletics athlete since very early on. Probably started when I was about 8 years old, around there, and then in school, and then got into more of a club environment when I was closer to 12, 13, and then just from there did it in high school. I was doing other sports too, basketball, soccer, all those things, baseball, whatever. And then by the time I went to university, I was doing track and field, sprints, jumps in the university program, traveled across Canada, competed, did some competitions in the United States. And then after my 4 years, or I think it was 5 years in Canadian university, did my master's degree in Montreal at McGill University, and then still kind of competed, but started coaching. And so I was coaching sprinters, hurdlers, jumpers, and from there kind of started working with other athletes, but always had a base of athletics, track and field athletes. And then, came back to Vancouver, was working in another field, more of like a engineering, municipal engineering field, transportation. And then was still coaching on the side, and said, oh, okay, this is kind of boring. So I moved into just coaching athletics full time, and basically started more with team sports, and then got back into coaching sprinters as almost like a side gig. For anybody who's, coaching in track and field or athletics, it's not the way you get rich. So I volunteered all that time just to coach a group of athletes who ended up, making national teams and going to different games. But really just got a lot of information out of that process. So volunteering my time, working with other teams to make money, and then would just use that information that I got from the track athletes and what worked, and then apply it to the team sport athletes. And then over time, with the help of things like in the internet, you write articles about what you found. I had a chance to work with Charlie Francis, who was Ben Johnson's coach. I worked with him for about 10 years, late in his career, and just put everything together, and eventually got some work and contracts with professional teams. And predominantly, I would say my work is NFL, but I've done work with NBA teams, just recently more with ice hockey, NHL teams, and some soccer teams in North America, MLS. And even, before the coronavirus hit, I was hoping to do some work with Major League Baseball. I had some contacts there, but everything's kind of on hold. I'm still doing consults online with different organizations, a lot of universities, and it's just a matter of seeing where everything kind of unfolds from here. But certainly I've built it up to a point where I have some areas of expertise, and people are tapping into it and have had some success working with some of these teams, and it's been interesting, the whole process, the whole 20 to 30 years of where I've come from and where it's ended up.
As an athlete, did you always know that you wanted to coach, or how did that happen?
No, I don't think. I think sometimes when you're an athlete, you're just focused on yourself, and then you have coaches, and you go like, oh, that was a good coach, or that was a coach I liked. Oh, that was a really crappy coach. I would never want to work with somebody like that or be somebody like that. Um, but I don't think at least for me, I don't think you go into it going, oh yeah, that's a real viable job, right? It just, because you kind of see it, right? You see what's involved, and like I said, for the most part, coaches aren't getting rich off of that profession, right? It's a very immersive profession where that's all you do. Like, oh well, that's not a very interesting person. That person's just a coach, right? They don't have any other hobbies because they're always so invested in it. And then when I started doing it in my graduate degree years, I just sort of stumbled into it like, oh, we need some help. Okay, coach, had some success, and you're like, oh, this is pretty cool. But again, even then, I didn't think it was like a viable job or career. I still don't think it is, but um, certainly there's demand for it. We'll see. Hopefully, there's still demand for it after this, but and then you can kind of branch off into other areas like rehab, which I've done, and also fitness. I have a little more of a following of people who recreationally just want to do some of the stuff that I do and get fit. So I think there's a lot of different areas you can get into off of the pro sports thing. I think a lot of people think, oh, I just want to work in pro sports, and that's great, and it can be. There's a lot of ups and downs because you're kind of defined by winning and losing, and not everybody can win. So, and even the people who are winning are always afraid that eventually they're going to lose. So it's not, it's not a happy place. Sometimes it is. It's either you're really happy or you're not. Um, but it's definitely an interesting environment to work in terms of like, oh, okay, these are the best athletes. I get to work with them, and you get to see the result on TV. And if they win a championship, you're like, yes, right. But I don't, I warn people, like, you shouldn't, like, a lot of people say to me like, oh, I want to just get to a professional team job, right? Like, that's my goal. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine. But there's a lot of other options out there, and it doesn't, just because you work with a professional team doesn't mean you've reached the peak of your industry. There's other ways you can do that, and a lot of the time when people get there, they're like, oh, I thought it was going to be different, or I thought it was going to be better, or I thought I'd be happier. And that's even despite the fact that some of these positions get paid very well. It doesn't matter after a while if you don't like what you're doing, you don't like the people you're working with. So yeah, I don't think, I think a lot of people who get into coaching don't necessarily think that was my intent all along. It just, you sort of fall into it. Whereas maybe if you're like, I want to be a doctor, like, you hear that a lot. Oh yeah, I want to be a police officer, I want to be a doctor. Yeah, you hear that, and people do it, and some people love it and some people don't. But I don't think with coaching you do that. And even some of the people I know who are actors, like famous actors that I've worked with, they kind of stumbled into it too. It's not like a real viable career choice. It's just sort of like, oh, this is kind of cool. So that's how it works out sometimes.
Talking about career peaks, what have been some of the most important moments in your career so far?
I don't know. That's a good question. Like, sometimes you think that if you, like I said before, like I got to speak in 2015. I got to speak at the NFL Combine to all the teams, medical staff, all their strength and conditioning staff, and that was cool, because you go there, you're like, oh, you see everybody, you're like, oh, I can see that team, that I got all 32 teams in front of me. And then I did it again in 2018. So I think you always think like, oh, I got to get there, and you do that, and you're like, oh, okay, that was pretty uneventful. Um, but it does open doors, so it's very hard to say like, was there one thing? And then I had the opportunity from that 2015 situation to work with the Kansas City Chiefs. The strength coach approached me, said, hey, we want you to help us on the speed side. Um, this is an area we really want to work on. And then 5 years later, they win the Super Bowl. So it's kind of like, oh, that was kind of cool. Like just thinking about that process and what we did every year to kind of keep things moving in the right direction. And if they win, you're like, oh, that's awesome. Like that's something you always kind of dream of, whether or not it was because of me or, their quarterback or, certain things they did. You can debate that, but at the same time, not many people get to be part of something and build towards that goal and actually realize that goal and go, oh, we won a championship. We won, which is very difficult, and lots of things can happen. So I think, things like that. And then even some of the athletes that I've worked with who've gone on to win medals and stuff, that's pretty cool as well. But I think a lot of it's going to come back to is you're going to look at your sort of body of work and go, okay, I've done this, I've done that. And I think it's always better to have sort of a broad sample of things that you've done that you can look back on and go, oh, that was really cool. Or that, I've done a lot of different things. And at the same time, I managed to still have like a family life. Um, you know, I don't get so caught up in it that you're hanging on every win and loss, and you're getting anxious about it, and you're holding it together mentally. Because I know a lot of people who are, say, in professional sports and they've been there their whole life, and I think it's very tough to get out of that too, because everything is so focused on, during the season, you don't have a life, you're just part of that team. And then in the off season, it's very hard to separate yourself because you're thinking of, well, we got to get ready for the next season. And, which is an interesting thing right now, is that nobody knows if there's going to be a next season. And so everybody's in sort of this hovering mode. And I think it's a very unique time in that respect, where people are going, well, what do I do with myself? Some people are working on continuing education and professional development. Some people aren't. They're going fishing or whatever. They're just going off and just waiting to hear when they're supposed to report to work. So I think that's the interesting thing right now, is that nobody knows what the heck's going on. And, you have to invent things and ways to keep yourself interested and keep yourself activated, because when you come back, what have you done with that time? So I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I just think you have to, you can have goals. And I think it's very interesting to say, like, I want to work on a pro team, and then you get there. Okay, well, now we want to win a championship, and then you get there, and then what? And I think, maybe somebody like Tom Brady or the New England Patriots are like, well, we got to win another one, and then we got to win another one, and then, let's get 10 of them. And then what? Right. And then at the end of it, you go like, are you happy? And you always find that it doesn't matter how much they win. The one thing they remember is the ones they lost. And so you have to keep that in perspective. It's like, well, yeah, we just got to win more and more and more. But what's grinding at you? It's that one loss in, 2012 that I can't get out of my mind. So I think it's really easy to get caught up in all that stuff. And you have to be able to step back from it and go like, yeah, that was pretty good. Right. Because every time you win 6 Super Bowls, somebody's going to win 7. Right. So you can't just go like, I have 6, like even the Michael Jordan thing, he won 6 championships, and all I can think about is, well, we should have done another one. Right. And wow, you won 6. You should be pretty happy with that. Like, so it's very interesting.
Yeah, trying to find meaning in the process along the way, I guess. Coming back on some of your previous experiences, I had the chance to read Speed Trap by Charlie Francis recently. I thought it was a very interesting book, not necessarily going into all the controversy and the drugs and that aspect of it, but even just from a coaching and a speed coaching standpoint, I thought it was very insightful. You said you worked for about 10 years with Charlie Francis. What were your biggest takeaways from spending so much time with a coach like Charlie?
I think most people don't really, never really spent time with him, and they just have opinions of him based on, like you said, the controversy and maybe some of the stuff he's presented in terms of his training process. But I think the biggest thing if you spent more than a weekend with him or a week or two, is that he had a really good idea of what he wanted and what training should look like, and but he wasn't stuck on anything. So it was like he would go in and he would assess, and he would say, okay, this is what we're going to work on based on what I see. But that, it was very adaptive. It was very, I'm not going to kind of prejudge where I think this should be. I'm going to watch and see, and then we'll make a decision. So he didn't really write training plans. Like, everybody's so obsessed about putting everything into a spreadsheet, and like, oh, I know exactly, like, in phase 2 on week this, we're going to do this. You're like, how the hell that's going to be what you're going to do? Like, I have no clue. I'll still go through that process and write stuff out, but I'm pretty liberal with going, well, let's just change it. I don't care. We're going to change it. I don't care if it's written down. This is what I see now. And he was very good at that. And he got to a point where he didn't write stuff down. He would go to the track. He knew what he did previous day. He knows where he should be next week, roughly. And then he would make decisions on what the work would be. And then later, some of the athletes would write this stuff down as part of their journal. And then that's how he went back and figured it out, what he did, right? And why it worked. So I think the biggest thing from him is that you have to have a certain base level of knowledge to understand what kind of training should be done given the circumstances, and then where it should go from there. But that takes experience. And I think a lot of coaches nowadays go like, oh, I'm doing this philosophy, or I'm doing this training program, and we're going to do this. And they'll just do it without any sort of adaptive responses or any just changes or modifications along the way, because they're so tied to it. It's kind of like dealing with, a pandemic. It's like, first of all, they go, oh, no, you don't need a mask, right? And there's obviously a reason they didn't want to get everybody hoarding masks. And then now you need a mask, right? And some people are so like, what do you mean? You said we didn't need a mask. Now we need one. It's like, right. And they just go, rather than going, well, okay, those are the circumstances. They change it because of this. And that makes sense. And I think a lot of people can't think laterally. And I think that's what you need to do to be a coach, is you have to have that flexibility and security about your knowledge to go, well, we're going to change it. But I would say that's a very, very small percentage of the population that understands that and is comfortable with that. So everybody wants something that's cookie cutter, right? Like, oh, I got to do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, right? And that works. That can work. Like, whether you're dieting or whether you're doing, I don't know, just general fitness stuff, you can just follow a template, and probably 90% of the time it's going to work. Now, is there a better way to do it? Well, certainly, it just takes a little more effort and a little more thought. But I guess a lot of people don't want to go there. So, like, there's people I've had to work with who have been doing the same thing over and over. And I hear stories too. Like, you'll hear of somebody working a professional team, and they're doing the workouts that they did as an athlete. They're giving those workouts to the people they're working with now, and they don't change it. So I think somebody was telling me that, there was a guy who worked in pro sports, and he just kept using the same programs. And then at some point somebody looked and said, well, your program from last year is exactly the same as what you did the previous year and the previous year from that. And how come you aren't kind of adapting and changing things? And the answer is, well, he doesn't know how, right? He's just copying what he did. And if he did this 2 years ago and they won a championship, well, guess what? He's going to keep doing it, even though he has no clue whether or not that's the reason they won the championship, right? So I think there's a lot of biases around, well, why don't we just do what we did last year because it kind of worked, and I don't really want to think about it. So I think that's one of the things I learned from Charlie, is that he was just very, very in the moment when he was coaching. And I don't think a lot of people, one, I don't think they can do it because they just don't have the knowledge to do that. And two, they don't feel secure about that. They don't feel like, oh, I have to have a plan. And you'll hear some people say like, well, if you don't spend all that time planning and writing it down and putting it, then you're not coaching properly. I agree there has to be some work up front to plan where you're going to go, but certainly, you know, I make stuff up all the time, like on the spot, like, and I'm not making it up, like, because I'm lazy. I'm just making it up because, wow, circumstances have changed. Like, hey, it's a little colder today. Maybe I won't do all that high speed work I was planning on doing because it's not, one, they're not going to be running fast. Two, there might be a perception on the base of the athlete that I feel a little colder, and there's a little apprehension, which changes things. So then you've got to change the work, right? Um, or somebody shows up and says, my knee is sore. What are you going to do? Plow through the workout because, you have to, or do you change it so that there's less stress on the knee joint? Do what you have to do. There's more than one way to get to your goal. So that's the biggest thing that I learned from him.
Talking about staying flexible and changing your mind, what are some of the things that you've changed your mind about throughout your career in terms of beliefs that you might have had previously when you were starting off and that kind of evolved throughout your coaching process?
Like I didn't lift weights when I was in high school. I didn't start lifting weights till I went to university. And then, things the pendulum swings a lot, right? So you're like, oh, weights are really good, right? Well, and it wasn't so much that the weights were good. Like if you lift weights, yes, you get stronger. Like you notice like, oh, I can lift more every year, right? The other part of it is that we had a really good training group and it was a good social environment, right? Like it's the whole CrossFit thing, right? Like is CrossFit good or is it just the fact you got a whole bunch of people in a room who are doing the same thing and cracking jokes or whatever? So there was a good sort of social component to everybody being in the weight room and cheering each other on and all that. And then I saw some performance improvements in things like sprinting and jumping, but we're doing a lot of stuff, so it's not necessarily just the weights. So I think initially weights were good, and then I would do it with my athletes. And then I got to a point where I found that, well, we were putting too much emphasis on it because for all those reasons I said, socially, everybody liked it and they were improving in the weight room, but I wasn't necessarily seeing the same linear improvement in their other stuff, like what counted, their sprinting and their jumping. And so I think I kind of fell off the wagon a little bit, where I thought the weights were so important and certain. And then you get into, even within weights, you get into these subcategories of like, well, Olympic lifting is the best, right? Because people are telling you that. And that was way before everybody else started Olympic lifting. So this would have been in like the 80s and 90s. And we were doing it. And then, obviously CrossFit helped Olympic weightlifting and everybody wants to clean and jerk and snatch everything. But I just found that it was competing with the same energy that I needed for people to sprint faster. And so and Charlie always told me he thought weights were a real general stimulus. So you can't try to get tricky and specific with them. Like you need to lift something, you need to push something, you need to pull something, and that's it. And so I've kind of fallen back to that where you need to do something. And I'll say that to people like, oh, could you do me a weight program for speed? And it's like, well, it's like the Bruce Lee thing. Like I specialize in the art of fighting without fighting. So we're going to do strength training in a way that really isn't towards that strength training end. It's something that we do that'll allow us to sprint better. But the best weight program isn't the best weight program for sprinting. It's like some very general program. And he had a great story about I think it was a Russian or Soviet sprinter female who was like one of the best in the world. And then she ended up marrying a guy who was a thrower. I think it was a hammer thrower, Yuri Sedek. I think that was the guy. And then he looked at her weight program, and this is, she's world champion. So he looked at her weight program and said, oh, your weight program is shit. We're going to change it. Right. And it was just probably a very general program. And so he added all these things in and her weights went up and then her track performance went down. She was never a world champion ever after that. Right. So you have to be really careful that just because you're improving one aspect of your training program doesn't mean it's going to positively impact the whole thing, right? So that was one of the things where, like, again, back and forth, you're like, weights are good, weights suck, or weights are good, right? And then somewhere the answer is always somewhere in the middle, right? Like, you have to do it. Like, I'm doing weights again now with my son during the pandemic, and I think I got to a point where I was just so, like, just I plateaued, even just psychologically around weightlifting. Like, oh, I did so much of it. I did, from 1987 to 2007, which is a long period of time, right? Or, I maybe even longer, like 25 years. I did 25 years of weightlifting, and now I'm like, forget this. I just don't like it. It actually is painful to actually go through a weight session. Like, I have a whole weight room in my house, right? I have all the bumper plates. I have a platform. I have a squat rack. I have, you know, great equipment, and I just hate it. It just, like, kills me to do it because I've done it so much. But then we started lifting. He's 15 years old, and we started lifting through the pandemic period here, and we're still doing it. We did like a 16-week program that I created years ago, and guess what? He's getting better, so he can almost bench press 100 kilos. He's like 15. I'm like, shit, I didn't do that until I was like 20. And he can power clean and squat and front squat and all these things. And I'm doing it with him. And guess what? I'm getting in better shape too. Like, my wife's like, hey, you look so much better. And I'm sprinting, and I feel a little more powerful and jumping and all that. So you have to do it. Do you have to do it excessively, or do you have to do it, like, absolutely precisely? Like, I've had people come who are like big weightlifting, Olympic weightlifting buffs, and they'll, like, come watch some of my sprinters lift, and they're like, oh, this guy could be better at this. Like, oh, fuck, who cares? Like, he's training to be a runner. Like, I get it. Like, the bar could be this much closer to his hips, or it could be this much higher, come off his hip up a little higher. Like, great. Always bending his elbows just a little too much. And I was like, well, we're not going to compete in Olympic weightlifting. Who gives a shit, right? The whole point is he's doing it, right? He's applying a stress, and the loads are pretty good. Like, I've had a lot of sprinters who could, power clean over 140 kilos. Like, that's pretty good. Like,
Yeah, that's solid.
At a 170-pound body weight. Like, I think that's pretty good. Like, do I need to do better? And then I worked with Christine Gerard, who was a 2012 Olympic champion, like, in Olympic weightlifting. And then you see what she does. She's really good at lifting, like, technically really good. Is she good at throwing a med ball or jumping or sprinting? No, she's not. She's okay. Like, I've probably had volleyball players that were better at doing some of those things, right? So does Olympic weightlifting make you a fabulous athlete? I'm going to say no. If you're a fabulous athlete and you do Olympic weightlifting, there is some things that you can benefit from, right? Just from a force application point of view. But there's no way that weightlifting is going to make you a great athlete. So as long as we understand that, but it should be part of a program, because I think there's a general stress it gives you, whether it's a hormonal response, whether it's bone density, whether it's connective tissue strength. Yeah, sure. So I just think we live in a world where people like to focus in on things and go, like, this is like the best, and this is the reason why you're good. And you watch Usain Bolt power clean, and you kind of throw up in your mouth a little. So if you're an Olympic weightlifter, you're like, oh, he ran 959. Imagine if he could power clean like 150 kilos. Like, yeah, he'd run 10 flat or 10-2 or whatever. So you have to be really careful. Like, Michael Jordan didn't train in Olympic lifts with Al Vermeil, and a lot of players did. Would he have been better? I don't know. Like, maybe not. You don't know, right? There was certainly something he did that was good for him. And he did enough of it. So he did some sort of weightlifting. And, I don't know. I always kind of struggle around those issues of, like, what has changed, a lot of things have changed, but it always goes through like a cycle. Like, you're like, okay, this is good. Okay, not so good. Okay, it's good again. And I think that's just how it is with life, is you're going to go through some changes, whether it's your political views. Like, I'm sure people have different views on religion and how they spend their money and how they parent their kids. And sometimes that works. Oh, that didn't work that time. Oh, it works this time. So everything is so situational, which goes back to that Charlie Francis example, is like, if you're so fixed into one approach, you're going to fail. Like, it's going to work one time, but I bet you it's going to be a total disaster the next time. So you have to have that flexibility and that confidence to go, well, let's kind of change things, right? You don't know, like, everybody, like, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with, like, the New England Patriots, because they did things a certain way. They had a quarterback who did it this way. He did this well. He couldn't run fast. He wasn't mobile. So this is how they did it, and they were successful. So now they have another quarterback or whoever it's going to be, and so they'll have to adapt. If they tried to do exactly what they did with Tom Brady, it's going to fail miserably. So I think you have to always see who's has that ability to adapt, and I would assume that Bill Belichick is good at that.
Yeah, so that's probably a good segue to go into field sports a little bit more. One of the presentation of yours that I watched recently, a concept that you brought up that I'd never heard before and that I find really helpful, not only in speed but in other realms as well, is the idea of speed reserve. Could you talk a little bit about speed reserve, what it is, and why it's so important, especially for let's say field sport athletes, football players, soccer players, rugby players?
Yeah, I like this idea. Like, if you think about it, you think about a car. So what is the average speed of a car going around daily in traffic? Like, it's, 50 kilometers, 40 kilometers per hour. Like, and then you look at the speedometer and you're like, wow, it says on here that this can go probably like 220 kilometers per hour. I mean, in Europe, it's different, right? In North America, you're like, well, most of the time you got to be between 50 and 120. Why does it go 240 kilometers per hour? Why do I need that, right? And you don't need that, but certainly having that ability to having that horsepower to do other things like accelerate, go up a steep hill, pulling a trailer, whatever. So it's nice to have that ability, that so you have this maximal capability, but most of the time you're operating here. Now, if that ceiling on that car wasn't 240, it was 150, well, there's going to be more stress on the engine to operate at 50, 60 kilometers than if you had an engine that could operate at 240 kilometers per hour. So having more horsepower gives you, a little more durability. It gives you a little more, I guess, options. It gives you more options, right? And I think that's the same thing in team sport. If all you can run is, let's pick an arbitrary number. Like, say you can run, your maximum is 30 kilometers per hour. Okay, you can run, and that's, let's say 32. The reason I'm going to say 32 is that most of these e-bikes now only provide enough power up to 32 kilometers per hour for legal reasons, I guess. And I think even in certain European countries, if you have a bike that assists you over 32 kilometers per hour, like, you can get a fine, you can go to jail. So 32 kilometers per hour, great. That's as fast as you can run. Well, that means your operating speed on the field might be 20 or 22 or 20, whatever it is, 25. Now, if your ceiling is now 45, you can run 45 kilometers per hour, which I think is closer to what the world record is, right? Now operating at 30 kilometers per hour is really easy. You can do it all the time because it's just a submaximal output. And so I think you want to raise that ceiling as high as possible, not because they're going to be running that in the game, but now they can do those lower speeds more effectively with less stress on their body. And they can do it more frequently throughout the entire duration of the game, right? And there was somebody had a great example. I think it was somebody challenged Fred Hatfield, which was like Dr. Squat, Dr. Fred Hatfield, to like, I think it was 400-pound squat as many times as they could. And I think there was a guy who was a bodybuilder and he did a lot of squatting at 400 pounds. It just worked on endurance at 400 pounds. And Fred Hatfield had done 1,000 pounds for one. And so somebody came up to Fred and said, well, this guy just works on endurance at that weight. He challenged you. I don't think you have a chance because he's so good at endurance. And then so Fred said, well, how much have I squatted? 1,000 pounds. What are we squatting at? 400. What's that? Well, that's 40%, right? And if you do the sort of math in your mind, you're like, 40% isn't really that much, right? So I think that the guy who was the endurance guy at 400, I think he did 26 reps, and I think Fred Hatfield did 45 reps at that weight, right? So even though he doesn't focus on endurance at a submaximal level, because he's so much, better at just his output is so much higher at a maximal level, now everything seems easy, right? And that doesn't mean you don't train endurance. I'm just saying, like, you want to train both ends of that spectrum. You want to be as fast as you possibly can be. And then if you're a soccer player, like, obviously you're doing some of the endurance running so that you can last throughout the game, throughout the season. But if you don't tap into that speed reserve piece and you don't try to increase your speed, you're going to be very limited in your abilities on the field. And if you do get up into a higher speed velocity band, you're probably going to be more susceptible to getting hurt because your body's just not used to it, right? It's just too close to your maximum. So that's how I have to explain to a lot of teams is why we're doing this linear sprint work. Like, oh, football players, most of them don't run farther than 10 yards or 5 yards. I'll hear that a lot. It's like, well, if you run them a little farther, they'll get up to a higher speed, right? And then that time when the game changes and somebody has to actually run that far, one, they're prepared, and two, for all those shorter distance runs, they're going to be better prepared because they're used to handling higher velocities, right? So, I have to go through that a lot. I have to explain that a lot with some of the teams and the coaches. So
Talk about coaching linear speed for field sport athletes. Do you have any special considerations that you think of when you're coaching them, especially for, let's say, athletes that are not top level pros that have a lot of experience already with sprinting? Do you teach sprinting mechanics differently to someone who's going to evolve on a field in a sport versus someone who's going to be on a track?
I don't think I teach it differently. I think your expectations have to be a bit lower. Like I said, even with that Olympic weightlifting example, it's like, sure, you want everybody to look like they have perfect technique and that's the goal, but usually you won't have a lot of time to work on that. So you have to kind of compromise, which is hard for people to do. So you go, okay, well, it looks close enough, which doesn't sound like, very precise, but that's the world we live in. Like, if you work with team sport athletes and you ask the coach, like, how much time can I have to work on linear speed? You'll be lucky if you get 15 minutes, 20 minutes, right? Including warm up. So what are you going to do with that time? Are you going to, like, meticulously work on foot placement and limb mechanics? I mean, well, you might spend some time on it, but if ultimately you got to get them to run too. So as long as you know how to divide that time up and budget the time, you spend a little bit on drills, or maybe one day you spend more time on drills and then the next day you spend more time on just pure acceleration. And so that's the difficulty with the team sport, because if you're working with a track athlete, you have 2 hours to work on all of these things. Like, that's what you do. You're a runner. If you're a soccer player, you want to spend time on tactical skill, strategic goals, right? And that involves, most of the time, it involves you handling a ball. So it's kind of incompatible with what we're trying to do on the speed side. So you have to have a separate period of time where they can work on that. And as a physical preparation coach, you have to fight for as much time as possible. Because there is, like, even on the skill side, you could say, well, they need to put in this many hours on skill and this many touches and all this other stuff you hear. And there's a point of diminishing returns for everything. So, maybe, sport coaches don't think that way. They don't think of, like, what's the sweet spot? Everybody looks at the 10,000 hour rule and think, well, it should be 30,000, rather than going, what's the quality of that time? So I think, if you can have a relationship with a sport coach and go, like, hey, give me a little bit of time here. It looks like the guys are getting a little, or the girls are getting a little, they're kind of fading in your work and they're just losing their attention span. We can get them to do some sprinting, and then you can come back and do more of your stuff. I think there's some validity and value in doing that. So, I just think it's different. And there's a lot of people who work in track and field saying, well, if I worked in team sports, I would do it like this. It's like, well, clearly you haven't worked in team sports, because they're not going to let you do that. Like, I'm going to take over everything. I'm going to tell them how it is. It's like, well, you're not going to have a job. So there has to be some compromise, and there has to be some modification, and you do the best you can, right? It's not going to be perfect. It's never perfect, right? So that's the one thing I always tell people that want to, work on these things with team sport athletes is, be prepared to be disappointed.
You made some great points about, let's say, logistics and how you allocate your time in sprint training for field sport athletes. There is the argument of if you compare a sprinter on a track and somebody running fast on a field, you can look at maybe heel recovery height, and you can look at how high they are off the ground compared to the sprinter on the track, and they'll usually be a little bit lower because they have to be ready for a change of direction, those kinds of things. Is that something that you usually coach, or do you kind of teach them how to sprint and then let the cards fall where they may on the field in terms of adjusting technique to the specific demands of the sport itself?
I mean, I don't get caught up in that. A lot of that is just smoke and mirrors. Like, people will, oh, this is how a soccer player runs. This is how a sprinter runs, right? And this is how a shitty runner runs. And it's like, okay, that's fine. You know, because you're analyzing things. It's like apples and oranges, right? So like, oh, we've taken this video or this picture of this guy who's a soccer player, and this is how he runs. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, nobody's taught him how to run, right? Probably, and through natural selection, because he's got better vision, or he's got better ball handling skills, or he was just in this part of the world, so he got selected because he was part of this academy or this program, right? There's all of these factors, right? But they're not being selected based on their running technique. They're being selected about how effective they are on the field, like goal scoring, whatever, assists, whatever it is, whatever stat they're using. So I try to be very careful with that. Now, most of those differences are due to a lot of other factors. So you could say, well, you got to be ready for direction change. Yeah, that's one thing, right? Because your feet have to stay close to the ground, because if you have to change direction or you have to receive a ball, you want to be up in a full sprinting position. You have to lower your hips so you can change direction. So that's the reality of that environment. The other part of it is, like, if you're running on grass a lot, you don't get a lot of elastic return from grass and turf even, right? So I have this great video where you show Jesse Owens running on a cinder track, and then you have Usain Bolt running on a synthetic track. And people are like, well, Jesse Owens wouldn't stand a chance, nowadays. Like, it's like, well, if he trained on a elastic track with, like, ultralight spikes, he would do quite well, and you would see his technique would change. So he's a product of his environment. It's not that, somehow Usain Bolt has evolved in 100 years or whatever, 80 years and changed the game. It's the game has changed. The track has changed, right? So, you just have to be careful with those types of assessments, because it's not based on coaching. And I think a lot of people want to say, like, oh, I can make you a better sprinter in soccer because I'm a smart coach. It's like, well, no, it has to do with the fact of what environment they were brought up in, what kind of surface they're playing on, and a whole bunch of other things. So I think you have to be careful, because if you go in and you try and change things and you try and cue people and do all these fancy things that you think are great, you could mess them up, because that's not part of how they became great. So I'm very careful about that. Like, most of the time when you go into a team setting, you're not going to go to their best player and go, like, I'm going to make you better, because they're the best fucking player, right? They're the best player. Like, don't mess that up. Like, if anybody did that to Michael Jordan or Wayne Gretzky or, Tiger Woods, you're going to have problems right away. And you're going to be, and guess what? Whose fault it's going to be? It's going to be your fault. But there's certainly players on that team and that roster that you can make better. And they're usually probably the middle of the road guys, right? And that was like, Al Vermeil worked with a lot of guys that were kind of the role players, right? And they bought into his program because they could see the value, and that elevated them, which helped the team. But he didn't get all upset because Michael Jordan didn't train with him. Like, well, I don't have to spend time with him. He's doing pretty good, right? And I think that's the approach you have to take. But everybody wants to gravitate towards the stars and say, like, we're going to make you better. They're fine. The only time I think you would do that is if they were injury prone. Like, and you came up with a solution, or you identified a problem related to their mechanics or their preparation that created all of these injuries. And this person had so much talent that you're like, shit, we got to fix this so that they can be on the field. There's an argument there. But other than that, like, if somebody's good and they're healthy, and you kind of look at their program and you go like, oh, they're eating Skittles. Like, well, okay, I don't think I want to change that. I mean, you probably could, but if you say don't eat Skittles, like you go to Marshawn Lynch and you say like, I don't want you eating Skittles anymore. Well, he's going to be pissed off, right? And he might not do other things you want him to do. So keep eating those Skittles, right? And just hand off the ball. So it's really complicated. And I think it's so easy from a marketing approach to say like, I have the answer. And it's like, well, the answer is not so singular. It's very complex, but that doesn't work in marketing pitches, right? So I think you have to be careful.
So you mentioned a couple already. What are the some of the other biggest mistakes that you see when it comes to coaching speed to field sport athletes?
I think a lot of people get caught up in equipment, right? Like, oh, like we're going to use this device or that device. Um, and I use equipment. Like I have a sled. I have we have timing devices. We have, obviously different shoes and cones, and like you get to see these debates of ladders, speed ladders, and all this shit. Like whatever, like if you use those things, that's fine. But certainly that's not the reason for the success of the program. The reason is like you have a good coach, you have good technical interventions, you have a good progression. It's based on sound principles. You're making good decisions. And a lot of the equipment is just kind of window dressing. Like you do it to create a different scenario or some variability in your training program, or you try to use, like I use hills and sleds to work on posture during acceleration. And, there's things that are useful, but a lot of the time people really focus too much on these pieces of equipment and the techniques with the equipment and try to make that their sort of trademark around their training program. And most of the time, if you see somebody pushing a lot of equipment, there's an ulterior motive behind it, and you have to be really careful. Again, if we go back to the Usain Bolt example, he just ran. Like I think he played some soccer as a kid too, but there wasn't any fancy piece of equipment. It was like, oh, look, there's a grass field or there's a track and there's competition. Like those things are way more important than what kind of shoes you're wearing, and those things usually come in after the fact, right? So like somebody becomes really good. Well, let's put a shoe on him and tell everybody that's why he's good. Like, but he was already good, right? There was a great ESPN 30 for 30 on Bo Jackson. I don't know if you saw that one.
I did not.
But they're basically saying like this guy was just talented from the beginning, and he didn't like practicing. He didn't like training. So he hated practice, and the people would make him practice because he could just show up and he could do amazing things. And now you can't do that with everyone, but there's certainly an argument for, less is more with a lot of these athletes, and grinding them and making them do stupid exercises that don't really apply can create more damage than good sometimes. So, and it wasn't like he was undisciplined. I would say he was probably, if you actually listen to him talk, he was very deliberate. He was very intelligent about the way he did things. And even that, we watched another one on Deion Sanders, and it's the same thing. Like a lot of these guys were driven by the competition, and they thrived in the competition. So giving them the right amount of competition is probably more important in a lot of cases than what kind of training they did. So, but for some reason we have this huge obsession about training right now. And I'm, again, I'm not going to crap on training because that's what I make my livelihood off of. But I do understand the importance or the lack of importance, or that you can't overweight that component, because if you don't have the competition, it doesn't matter. like even with my own kids, like they seem to thrive with the right type of competition, and they would innovate and create in their games. And then you're like, oh wow, I didn't teach him that. How did he do that? And so I don't know, it might have been video games or something, but they have an idea in their head how to solve a problem, and they do it, and then that's how you get better. We don't train those things, like, so that's why there's an argument for using an agility ladder or stepping over hurdles from a physiological point of view. I don't think there's an argument from a skill specific point of view, because people will auto regulate in the situation anyways. So they're not going to step like they do in a ladder when somebody's chasing them or trying to tackle them. If they did, they would get destroyed, right? So, but stepping over something and putting vertical force in the ground is useful from a training physiological point of view. So, I just think it's so easy to fall in the equipment trap, because that's what you see, whether it's a social media thing, whether it's a marketing campaign. It's around what shoes you're wearing and what equipment you bought or what app you have on your phone, or, do I use a GoPro? Do I don't know, like, use something. But usually the simple way, like I was talking to somebody about this, and they're like, oh, I want to buy a sled and I want to do this and a weighted vest. And I said, a lot of the old school stuff was built around tires. So like they used to drag tires around, and then you put a couple of shot puts in the tire. Now it's a weighted sled, right? And it worked really well. You need a rope, you need a tire. Like, it's not difficult to find a tire. And then the old version of like a weighted vest or something was like, you get an old inner tube, a big thick inner tube, and you fill it with sand, and you clip the ends, or you can zip tie it, right? And you put it on your back, and it formed to your back because it was soft and it was sand, and you would do jumps with that. So the path to good training isn't limited by your bank account. It's just, are you willing to do the work? But I agree that sometimes you have to have equipment to get people excited, and you have to have technology. But the more we can get away from that and not rely on that, I think the better off you're going to be.
About 3 months ago, when this whole COVID started out, we were kind of forced to transition to modes of training without any equipment. You put out a series of really interesting videos about indoor running, and different kind of modalities that you could use running in place, whether it's tempo runs or even kind of running A's, or just sprinting options. Can you talk a little bit about those and where they came from, and how they can effectively be used in a situation where we don't have access to any equipment, or even outdoors sometimes?
Yeah, something as simple as running in place or jumping in place is quite effective, right? Like, because everybody has access to gravity. The biggest complaint I heard was like, well, I live in an apartment and my neighbors below me are getting upset. So that's a constraint. But again, I think people are so used to like, oh, I get to go to the gym, and like, I'm going to get on the treadmill, or I'm going to get on, I'm going to lift this weight, or I'm going to swing a kettlebell. And it's like, do you really need that? There was one example. Was it a football team or something? Like, oh, like somebody was going, oh, these football players should all have weights at home already. And it's like, well, no, a lot of them just lift at the facility and go home, and they want to get away from that stuff. So there's a percentage of players who have their own weights and they're driven, but there's a lot of players who don't give a shit about training when they go home. They just want to do whatever they do, play video games or whatever. So they showed some guy who was like lifting his couch or something, because that's the only thing he could lift, or bench press his couch. But you could do push-ups, you could do explosive push-ups, you could do, there's no limit to what you can do with gravity in your body, right? And that's how a lot of these plyometrics started. Like, the guy training in Siberia couldn't go outside because it was too cold, so he jumped up and down, or he jumped off of something, or he jumped onto something. So there's no limitation. Like, you can come up with these things. Do you need some guidance? Yeah, there could be some progressions around these things. But I just think the will to do it is the missing piece. I think if there's a desire and you want to train, it's like, well, it's so boring, right? It's like, well, geez, like, we're overstimulated as it is. So guess what? Most stuff is pretty boring, right? Reading a book for a lot of people could be boring, right? But you're going to get something out of it. Jumping up and down or jumping rope, I think is interesting, because like that was a really big physical preparation tool, 50, maybe even 100 years ago. Like the medicine ball, was around 100 years ago. So these things aren't new. And then Al Vermeil sent me this video of like World War One amputees. They were doing like jumps over like I don't know, ropes or hurdles, and they were doing plyo jumps as part of their rehab, right, to get them back. And so like that's 100 years ago. They were doing plyos as part of return to life or return to war. So none of this stuff is new. It's just, do you have the will to do it, right? I can give you some guidelines of how long to do a running high knee in your apartment, how I would do the rest work to recovery ratios and all that. But are you going to do it? And that's all we did during that. Like I said, we couldn't go to a track or to a field. Well, we have a hill behind our house that's paved, and we're doing hill sprints, right? And there's a strength component to that. There's a speed component to that. And my kids didn't miss a beat because we just did it. And it's boring, especially for my kids, but when they see the result and see how they get better, there's an incentive there. And so it's very interesting. Like, I don't seem to have a problem with well, I have a problem with the pandemic in general, but I don't have a problem with keeping myself busy. There's always stuff to do. And from an exercise point of view, I have no problem with that too, because I'm used to boring. And do I have to go out and eat? Do I have to be able to go out and socialize with people at the bar or the beach? I'm not that guy, right? So it's not like a huge blow to me where you see everybody else is like, oh, I've got pandemic fatigue and I got to go out and hug people and lick their hands or whatever. Like, what the hell is wrong with people? Like, there's lots of stuff you can do, right, to make yourself better. But I think people always go for the low-hanging fruit, and it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is, right? So
you wrote a really interesting article on return to play a few weeks after the pandemic started on Simply Faster, if I'm not mistaken. Now that we're kind of on the other side, and most of pro sport teams have taken up training again, how did this transition pan out, and did most of them do a good job, or do you see a lot of injuries as a result of return to play that's been done too quick, too soon?
It's hard to say. Like, obviously there's soccer, football going on in Europe. There's rugby and AFL in Australia. There was a tennis tournament that Djokovic was at where everybody got sick. There hasn't been a lot. There's been auto racing. There's been golf. So there's not a lot of examples, I'd say, where we can go, oh yes, definitively, people did it right or did it wrong. Like, we won't really know until some of these other leagues come back. But I think people anecdotally have been identifying like a higher injury rate. But the problem is with all of this is that you have all these guys who were at home, and some of them worked out and some of them didn't, right? And so you have this disparity between your group. And so when you come back and say, okay, we're going to do some training, where do you set the bar? Because there's so much variability within your group. And if you start at the lowest common denominator for the guys who haven't trained, well, then the other guys are going to detrain and they're going to be pissed off. But if you start too high, then the guys who didn't train are going to get hurt. So, a lot of the pro teams have told me, like, they're going to come back and do small group training. Well, how do you divide the group? Well, guess what? I would sit them down in a room and go, who trained? Like, we're not going to punish you if you didn't train. Like, who's in the worst shape of their, like, maybe there's 5 categories, like 0 training, that's category 1. There's like once a week training, whatever. And then there's somebody who trained every day. Then that's how you subdivide your groups. And then you have to have a different approach for each of those groups. Like, that's how you have to do it. And maybe you limit when you get back to practicing, you have to limit the guys who are in category 1 who didn't train and have less minutes for them as part of the scrimmage or whatever. But there has to be a systematic approach to uh, the variable preparedness levels amongst these guys. And if you don't do that, you're going to have problems. I guarantee you're going to have problems. So our team, one, there's two factors. One, is there enough time? So when you get them back, is there enough of is it 2 weeks? Is it 4 weeks where you can do this progression and get everybody back to their level of preparedness they need to be? And then the other factor is, do you have the skill and knowledge to do that properly amongst your staff, and the compliance of the players to do that, right? Because some players are like, I don't want to come back to the bubble, or I don't want to, there's going to be everybody is used to so much freedom. When in the old days, like now that everybody's making shitloads of money, like you're making $20 million a year, the first thing you're thinking is like, I don't want to do anything. As opposed to the, 50 years ago when guys made like enough money to buy dinner, like they're all like, yeah, I love this, we're going to keep training, right? So it's really bizarre how values have changed and expectations have changed. So you bring back all the millionaires. Are they going to comply? Do you have the right team? Do you have the right culture, for lack of a better word, to bring people back properly? Some teams will, and then some teams it's going to be a shit show. You just know it, right? Like guys are like, I don't want to do that, right? So you play them and then they get hurt. There's no secret. Well, there is a secret formula. It's you got to be organized and you have to have a plan, a good plan. And then the other side of that spectrum is just whatever. We'll get back together. We'll let the sport coaches handle it, and they're going to do exactly what they did before. You think they're going to change? They're not going to change. That's just they know how to do what they do, right? So
on a more general level on this pandemic, where do you stand? What do you see happening right now? Do you think we're out of the woods pretty soon? Do you think it's going to last for a while?
Well, a lot of it's going to depend on what the governments do, right? Like it has nothing to do with sports. Like everybody could say like, well, is the NFL organized or is the NBA organized? And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your plan is, because if you're in a country where there's not enough testing, systematic testing that's valid, and you're getting good data, and you have different levels of government with different recommendations. So if the leader of your country is saying like, it's going to disappear and don't wear a mask and whatever, show up to my rallies, that's not good, because it's going to keep spreading. And then you have these, and then on the other part of it is like, well, this isn't any worse than the flu. Well, even if it was the flu, say it was the flu and it was just as transmissible, right? Well, now you have people sick all the time, and you can't have a practice, or you can't go on a tour. You can't play because all your guys are sick. Like that's pretty bad. Like I hate getting the flu. Do you love getting the flu? Right? Like, so we could debate about the lethality of it, and certainly there's going to be problems when you come back. If you even if you create a bubble, like, oh, we got this bubble, right? Well, you got hotel workers coming in and out. Who are they? Do you have to contact trace them? And if you have 30,000 or whatever, 50,000 cases a day in your country, somebody's going to come back and bring it back in the bubble. And then now that you're in a bubble, it's like a senior's home now. Everybody in that bubble is going to get it. So it's just a nightmare right now, because there's no unified approach in certain countries, right? Canada's pretty good, for the most part. And obviously a lot of European countries are getting on the ball now, and they have it under control. And most people are flatlining this, and definitely Asia. But there's other countries where it's just exploding. And if it's not handled on a societal level, how the hell are you going to do it on a sport level? So Australia has just over 100 cases, or like very little. Mm-hmm. But one of my friends, Mike Hurst, contacted me and said, because they've had a little bit of a bump up, they're starting to close down interstate borders, right? And just trying to contain it, because they just don't want this to get out of hand. So that's the approach you have to have, right? But if you just let it go rampant, like, you're going to be chasing like greased pigs all over the place. It's just it's not sustainable, right? So at some point, everybody has to get on the same page, and you have to go, okay, this is what we're doing. If we all do this, we can return to sport adequately. But as soon as you have a few people that don't listen, it's going to ruin it for everybody. So I think that's why Asia has done quite well. Like you could say, like everybody's saying, well, China, you look at their numbers and they must be lying. And it's like, well, maybe they're fibbing a bit on some things, but it's very easy to crack down on people in China, as you know, right? Like, okay, we're not doing this. Everybody's got to wear a mask and you can't go outside. Like if anybody does, then you go to a prison for the rest of your life. So people are very compliant with that sort of stuff. And then in Japan, if you've ever been in Japan, everybody's really compliant all the time for everything, right? Like after they had their tsunami, people are lining up and nobody's looting, nobody's doing anything like that. Like that is awesome, right? That's what we need. But then you look at other countries, they don't have that discipline, or that's not part of their culture. It's just crazy. So, I mean, we all need to be like Japan, honestly. So,
So that from a, like you said, from a government standpoint, if nothing's done, things are not going to necessarily move in a great way. From a cultural standpoint, within sporting organizations, in that uncertain, like an ongoing environment. I mean, we did it with the rugby team here, where we had Zoom calls every week, whether it was for the physical preparation, for the sports. I mean, it worked well for a couple months, but I could see that getting really old really quickly if it extends to 4 6 months beyond. What would you advise in those situations for sport teams to really try to stay connected from a cultural standpoint?
I mean, you just got to do it the best you can. Like, everybody's going to have weak moments, right? But communication is going to be the biggest thing, like staying in touch with people and reminding them how important this is, and reminding them to, stay away from situations where they could contract this. And that's all you can do. Like, it's just like if you have a family, you're doing whatever. The first priority is to make sure your family is protected and safe. And then from there, it's like your extended family and your friends, and you're trying to communicate these things. But even with friends, like I have friends who just don't have the same philosophy, and they're going out and doing things, and like, oh yeah, we can go out to eat now. It's like, well, yeah, but it's like eating in a penalty box. Like there's plexiglass everywhere. Like how fun is that, right? Um, but you just gotta, as a team, collectively buy into the same approach, and talk to each other. And if you can get together, you have to follow the rules to make sure that nobody gets sick. And because every time somebody gets sick, it just delays the return. And I think that's the biggest thing right now is, um, you can hope that it's a seasonal thing and this is going to go away, but and there's this whole herd immunity argument is really difficult too. Like you saw, if anybody goes through and looks at the 1918 Spanish flu, they needed like 50 to 100 million people to die before they gained that herd immunity. I think a third of the world's population got the virus, and out of that, they don't even know the number, but they said 50 to 100 million people died. Is that what it's going to take? Because that seems to be the approach in certain countries, is like, well, just let it spread and then we'll see what happens. And well, guess what? That's going to happen. I think it was at least two plus years in the Spanish flu where they had to see this thing run its course, and people died, and then it went away because all those people died. We don't want that scenario. At least I don't want it. And if they, I was watching a thing about certain antibody-based therapeutics that they're coming with. So it's not just vaccines. There may be therapeutics that get people antibodies, and all of those things are going to count. But it's going to be a lot easier on the sports world if society got their act together, because now it's easier to bring people together. And you don't know, if you bring your team of 12 guys together, if there's low infection rates in that community, then the chances of them testing positive are very low. But you can see now in the US, they have, bring back baseball players. Well, 10 people tested positive. You bring back basketball players. Well, 6 people. It's because in their communities, that's where they're getting it, right? So whether or not it's a bad virus or people are going to get really sick, and we don't need to debate that, but the numbers are going to go up, and the perception is it's not safe to bring back sports, so sports won't come back. And then even individual players are now making those calls, because it's not just about the players. it's about their families and their extended, and then even the coaches. Like I was telling somebody, when I went to the NFL Combine, there's a lot of older guys still working in the NFL, especially in positions like athletic training and equipment. So those are guys that have been with teams for like 20 plus years, because they tend to not be fired positions when a coaching change happens, right? Like the strength coach always gets fired, but the medical staff are consistent. So you have guys who work with the same team for 25 plus years, and that guy may be in his 60s, right? And some of the prominent coaches are in their 60s and even higher. Like, well, I don't know how old Pete Carroll is, but he's getting close to 70, right? So are you worried about those guys? Like, is it going to take Pete Carroll, Andy Reid, Bill Belichick all getting the coronavirus before people take it seriously? I hope not, right? So, it's very complicated. But as a sports organization, you just got to protect your own. You got to do what you can to communicate. And I think most players are pretty good, because they see it, as long as you put it in terms of what their health impacts their livelihood and their earning potential, then they're like, oh, okay, right? And get the agents involved too. If I was an agent, like, hey, you lock down, you stay the heck away from everybody, because that's the agent's livelihood too, right? So you got to hit them where it hurts, and or at least bring attention to that.
Even though it's not been a very long time since this whole situation started, have you seen any positive effects of this lockdown on the speed performance field as a whole?
The positives have been that there've been a lot of people contacting me wanting to learn more at this time, because they have the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's positive for me, but I think it's positive in terms of people wanting to use the time wisely. Like that, there was a great article in Wired magazine that I posted on Twitter, and it was talking about, like, this is an opportunity to, everything's accelerating, right? It's like great innovations happen during times of disaster or like war, right? So I remember I went to there's a museum in Oregon. It's like an aerospace museum.
Mm-hmm.
And they have like World War I planes and World War II planes and space capsules and helicopters. It's a great place. If you're ever in McMinnville, Oregon, go visit the Evergreen, whatever, Aeronautics Museum, because they have like the Howard Hughes's big Spruce Goose plane in there. It's huge, right?
Yeah.
So this is a great museum. So we got inside I think it was like a B-19 bomber. It's like an old World War II bombing plane, and you get in there like, oh shit, it's really cramped in here. Like most of the guys that were in the Air Force, I guess, were short guys because they could fit in these planes. But they had a gun in there on the side, how they have the opening and you can like shoot things, right? And it was a machine gun, and they had the bands of ammunition that fed into the gun, and they would say like the whole plane would just fill up with shells during the battles. And this gun, the guy was showing it to me, and you're looking at it, and the way it fed, he says, like, this gun here that was developed in 1940 or whenever, this is the same gun we use now in our Black Hawk helicopters.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like, what, 80 years ago, or, and so that technology has not changed because they innovated so well in that time of war. Mm-hmm. That, we can't really make this better. This is actually pretty good. So I think that's what the situation we're in now is. People are accelerating certain technologies faster. So the communication, Zoom, Microsoft is doing really well at this time. And I think obviously Amazon. So all these technology companies are doing really well. And I think it's contingent for other people to try to innovate at this time, because you have the time, and two, we have no choice. So maybe this idea that we're using technology to communicate with athletes and coaches and future coaches is probably the best time to do it, right? And I'm converting all of my stuff to online courses. And at first I'm like, no, I got to deliver it in person because that's the best way to do it. And now I'm finding different ways to do it online. Are they as good? Well, I'm trying to make sure they're as close as possible, right? And if anything, I'm putting in more information, and I'll probably charge less money. And so you're getting a density of instructional material that's way better than an in-person, right? Because you don't miss anything. Sometimes when you're teaching in person, you're like, oh shit, the time's going really fast and I can't cover that piece. But now you can, because people do it at their own time and convenience. So it's sort of on demand learning. So that's certainly going to be something that I explore a little more. And the other thing is I can reach, like when I had to do a course and plan it, I said, okay, I'm going to pick this weekend in July in New York. And then people would contact me right away and say, I got to go to a wedding, or I got this, or I got that. So they couldn't make it, or that's too far and it's really expensive to get a hotel room in New York, right? And so there were barriers to people coming to my courses, whereas now they can do it from home at their own convenience at the time they want to do it. So I think that's an advantage of me thinking, well, like, I can reach more people. I can reach people in different countries. I can reach people at different times of the year. So I think that's kind of cool. Like it's kind of forced me to accelerate that process.
Getting towards the end of the interview, Derek, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I've got two more questions for you. The first one, do you have any advice for coaches who want to teach and coach speed better to their athletes, whether it's now, if they can, or when they come back from the lockdown?
Well, obviously it's sign up for my course. No, just kidding. um, well, I think again, it is a good time. Like if you can't physically work with them in person, then maybe this is a time when you feed them resources so that when you're ready to come back and do the in-person, they have a bit of a knowledge base that they can work from. So if you send them good examples of what drills and exercises should look like, what people good performers look like in their sport, then I think you can't discount the value of them using that as a visualization. Like we know that if you think about shooting basketball free throws, like there's studies that show that helps, like that improves your ability to actually do it. So the visualization piece and getting those examples in your head is very good. And even from a coaching side, if you like, there was a great again, I've been watching all these ESPN 30 for 30s, but there's a great thing about Bill Belichick and Bill Parcells. They were talking and they interviewed them, and they asked Parcells, why is Belichick so good? He says, well, he's seen so many players throughout his career, and he knows like this player is similar to this guy that I have, so that worked with him, so I'm going to work on that with this guy. And so if you have that database of scenarios and cases and athletes you've worked with or you've seen, now when somebody comes to you and they're like, well, they're about the same height, they have the same tendencies, now you know exactly what template to use with them, right? And that's, having that ability to see somebody and go like, oh yeah, that reminds me of a solution I did 20 years ago is very, very helpful. But you have to spend the time and review those videos and get familiar with those types of scenarios. And then they're a little more readily at your fingertips, right? So this is what you should be doing with your time, essentially.
Right. So if people want to dive into that education that you're putting out, where can people find out more about the courses that you're offering and about you online?
I'm still in the process of transferring all my running mechanics courses. So there will be more information on the runningmechanics.com site. I also work out of the sprintcoach.com site, but then even if you follow the social media, on Instagram, I'll try to post notifications around, like we're doing like a virtual training camp right now. If you go to at Derek M. Hansen on Instagram or Twitter, you can see notifications there. And then I also have one at Running Mechanics where I have all my course stuff there will be announced. So yeah, social media, websites, I will have more notifications, and hopefully in the next month I'll have things that people can dive into. So
looking forward to all that, Derek. I'll link those in the description below. Thanks so much for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Yeah, no problems. And if anybody has any questions, Sean, you can kind of direct them to me, and hopefully it's not too complicated. So easy to think, oh, what am I going to do now? Like either feeling helpless or trying to cram too much stuff into a short period of time is very common nowadays. And I think everybody's just got to take a breath and step back and go, okay, what can I control and what can't I control? And just focus on the stuff you can control, and don't rush yourself. Like we may be in this for the next year, at least at minimum, right? So it's so easy to go like, well, I'm going to get anxious and I'm going to be upset about all the stuff I could have done. And if you get into that mindset, it's very limiting and it's very, very dark. So I think you have to look at, well, what opportunities are there out there for me? And certainly the learning piece is one, and just doing things differently. Like you have to learn how to do things differently. And I have friends who are like, well, like even from a physical therapy point of view, people are like, well, I can't touch people. Like I can't, okay, well, what can you do? Like, are there alternatives? Because if you keep thinking that we're going to come back to the way things were, you're setting yourself up for failure, right? I mean, because why would you prepare for how things were? Because you already know how to do that. Like, if it comes back, then great. Oh, I just do what I used to do. So why don't you start putting your effort into stuff that you're not good at and other new things that you haven't done? Because if you can't go back to the way things were, now at least you're ready, or at least you're close to being ready to do the new stuff. So, but some people are just like, I can't do that. Well, you better. Like Blockbuster Video used to be a big thing. You used to go buy, pay for rent a video, physically take it. But Netflix, basically decimated them, right? So nobody gives a damn about Blockbuster anymore because we've moved on.
Yeah, some wise words of wisdom from you to finish the podcast. Derek, have a great day.
Okay. Take care, Sean.
Take care.